This is World Studies. In case you forgot what class you are in, this is the first video of week 6. So hopefully now you've turned in your week 5 packets. You've gotten the chapter 18 test taken. We started chapter 19. You're able to get the first homework turned in as well. And now we are partway through the chapter 19 notes under Roman numeral 2, big letter C. I really hope that none of you accidentally turned in your notes, because obviously now you still need them. So we are picking up with big letter C. Remember, the Cold War was the consequence of World War II. World War II ended, and out of World War II arose two sides: capitalism, or democracy, led by the United States, and communism, or socialism, led by the Soviet Union. And these two sides never really fought each other, but they were competing with one another for control and influence around the world. And now we're going to talk about some crises that took place during this Cold War. These exceptions, we're about to talk about some crises, a crisis that took place in the Cold War. These were usually limited conflicts. They aren't going to be all-out wars, total war like we see in World War II, but they will take place. So let's get started. Number 1, the Berlin blockade in 1948. After the war, Germany and Berlin had been divided between the Western Allies and the Soviets. The reason for that was to make sure Germany would never be powerful enough again to start World War III. The US, Britain, France, and the Soviets all received a part of Germany. Berlin, the capital, which you can see on the map there, located in the middle of Russia's territory, was also divided among the four. Eventually, the US, Britain, and France combined their possessions. West Germany was democratic. East Germany was communist. West Berlin would be democratic, and East Berlin would be communist. Well, the communists wanted all of Berlin for themselves. So the Soviets cut off all access to West Berlin in the hopes of claiming it for itself. By cutting off access, no trains or vehicles could arrive in West Berlin to provide much-needed food and supplies for the bombed-out city. The only option seemed to surrender the city to the Soviets or risk a military intervention, which might lead to war. What's the option? Which option should they take? Well, the Allies decided to go with option number 3. For 11 months, the US and Britain delivered everything in a massive airlift. They could blockade the roads and the trains, but they could not blockade the skies overhead. Eventually, after 11 months, the airlift was lifted. Unarmed planes loaded with supplies landed in West Berlin. Get this, every 90 seconds, 24 hours a day for 11 months. The Soviets finally backed down and lifted the blockade when they realized that the Allies would continue to do this. The struggle ended without a shot being fired. West Berlin was still free. Number 2. The Korean War. Korea had been divided into a communist north and a democratic south after World War II. The U.S. sought to develop South Korea as a free and independent nation. The Soviets quickly built up a strong communist government and military and prepared to conquer all of Korea. In short, North Korea invaded and took most of the peninsula, but was pushed back at Incheon, when the U.S. and UN got involved. If you look in your books at page 354, it shows you a map. You see the original border between the two sides. You can see in the bottom the farthest advance of North Korean forces, September 1950. You see that they took most of the peninsula. And then in the middle of the country, near the capital of Seoul, South Korea, you see Incheon. That's where the U.S. and the UN forces retaliated, pushed back the North Koreans. In fact, they were able to push almost all the way up to the top part of North Korea before China supported North Korea. And this will create a stalemate until an agreement was made to stop fighting. We talked about stalemates back in the World War I chapter. Neither side was able to gain a complete advantage in this war. With Chinese help, they were able to fight back to near the original boundary. By 1953, both sides agreed to stop fighting. The end result of the Korean War, neither side won, neither side lost. At best, communism in Korea had been contained. At worst, communism still existed in Korea, and it would remain divided, still divided to this day. The DMZ is a demilitarized zone at the 38th parallel, and that division continues to this day. Number 3, the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is probably the most dramatic moment in the history of the Cold War, the closest moment in which World War III almost happened, or at least nuclear fallout almost happened. The Soviets had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, or allegedly had. The U.S. wanted them removed. It was bad enough that the Soviets had nuclear missiles pointed at the U.S. from Russia, but the U.S. had missiles pointing back. If missiles had been launched, enough warning would have been given for us to return fire. But if missiles were launched from Cuba, there would not be enough warning. They could attack us, and we wouldn't be able to respond fast enough. So, the U.S. responded with a naval blockade of Cuba, and secret negotiations led the Soviets to remove the missiles. In return, the U.S. would remove recently installed missiles from Turkey, and the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba, which, of course, had fallen under communist control. Crisis averted. Number 4, the Vietnam War. Recognize that these dates you see right here, 1954, 1975, are for the duration of the actual fighting. The U.S. was not involved this entire time, but they will be involved towards the end of the war. But in 1954, Ho Chi Minh, the leader of communist forces, ended French efforts to control Vietnam at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. After World War II, France had sought to strengthen its control over its colony. Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam independent, and in this key battle, French forces were defeated. After this conflict, Vietnam will be divided into a communist north and a democratic south. Sounds like you've heard a similar story before. Yeah, Korea was a similar story. But again, North Vietnam was not content to allow a democratic South Vietnam, and they will seek to invade. The Viet Cong were communist agents put into South Vietnam who worked for the North. The Viet Cong worked with the communists in North Vietnam and China in an effort to undermine the South's government and make all of Vietnam communist. The U.S. and several other countries soon began to send financial support to South Vietnam in order to prevent its fall to communism. U.S. involvement escalated, casualties increased, and the American public began to oppose the war, especially in the 1960s and early 70s. Although the U.S. won every major battle against the enemy, over 50,000 Americans died during the conflict. Also, many Americans grew tired of the war. The media also convinced many Americans that the U.S. was losing the war. In the end, the U.S. got out. After the U.S. pulled out of the war, communist forces took over all of Vietnam. And that's kind of important to note. The U.S. only lost the war because we quit the war. The U.S. lost South Vietnam. South Vietnam was overthrown only after the U.S. pulled out of the war. After Vietnam fell, other Southeast Asian countries like Laos and Cambodia also fell to communism. In your books, turn to page 355, and I want you to read the box entitled Loss of American Confidence. Once you have finished that box, please unpause, and we will continue. Letter D. Rivalry for technological supremacy. World War II had brought about great military technological change. Atomic weapons, jet engines, rockets, and more. After the war, many assumed the winner of the technology race would become the dominant world power. Actually, the winner would be the nation with the stronger economy. Number one, both sides developed improved versions of military weapons. This included tanks, planes, submarines, ships, and radar systems. Since the U.S. had a technological edge on the Soviets, they had to constantly guard against spies who worked for the USSR. Number two, nuclear. Both sides, we've already mentioned, continued to develop more destructive nuclear weapons. By the end of World War II, the U.S. had used the atomic bomb. The Soviets detonated their first bomb in 1949. In response, the U.S. built the first hydrogen bomb, which was even more powerful, and the Soviets built one soon after. You can see both will develop stronger and more deadly weapons. In fact, the fear became of what was called a mutually assured destruction, otherwise known as MAD, the practice of stockpiling more than enough nuclear weapons to destroy one another. Both the U.S. and USSR stockpiled enough weapons to destroy one another. As the Cold War continued, this led to the signing of treaties designed to reduce the number of nuclear weapons. It was madness for them to continue this, and yet they did so. Number three, space, the final frontier. No, space. In 1957, the Soviets began the space race by launching Sputnik, which, by the way, was the first man-made satellite. While the U.S. hurried to catch up in this race, the Soviets made another leap forward by launching the first man into space. In response, the U.S. determined to win the race by sending a man to the moon first. In 1969, we will win that race by becoming the first nation to travel to the moon. In fact, to this day, we are still the only nation to do so. As Neil Armstrong said, that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Both nations will also develop satellite technology for military and civilian use. Satellites enabled communication, allowed nations to spy on their enemies without the risk of being shot down, and were able to record weather conditions. That's all the notes we're going to cover for today. I want you to draw a line in your notes and recognize that you have a quiz that you need to take. This is the Chapter 19 quiz. Please make sure you refer to your notes to take that quiz. Also, turn in your activities book to page 155. 156. It's entitled Children of the Storm, and it shows us what life was like in Soviet Russia during the Cold War. Please read that story and answer the questions on 155, 156. Please don't forget the questions on page 156. That's 2 questions. You don't want to lose those points just because you didn't see it. Hope you all have a good rest of the day. Be good, do good. Bye.